Hello and welcome back to Nick Geo. It's been a hot minute because I was actually away in Colombia, but that is not going to be the focus of today's video. Today we're going to continue the theme of focused topics and we're going to look at Athens, Greece. Athens is a very large city, so I figured why not we break it down into a whole bunch of digestible neighborhood-sized bits that we can talk about individually. In other words, this may come off as a bit of a tourist guide, but thankfully there's just so many cool things to talk about. Also, before we dive into this, I want to give a shout out to one of the specific sources that I used for this video. Normally I list all of my sources and links at the end, but there was one that really stood out for this one. I want to say thank you to Matt at athensguide.com. Not all, but a good chunk of the information for this video came from that. Let's get at it. First neighborhood that we're going to take a look at is Ziri. Being one of the oldest neighborhoods, it can date back to the Greek War of Independence from the Ottoman Empire in the 19th century. A popular spot for shopping and nightlife, there's plenty of stuff to see in the small area of Athens. The center of it all is known as Platira Irun, or Heroes Square, which is recognized as a symbol of anti-establishment. Pre-independence, it was a hotspot for revolutionaries and gang members alike. Today, the neighborhood has all sorts of different street art with a lot of stories behind it, and you can actually get a guided tour to talk about it with you. In 2012, Pitaki Street was opened up, which is basically a giant light ceiling along the alleyways, mostly donated by people with unwanted lights and lamps. For a deeper look into some of the history, you're also very close to the ancient Agora of Athens, found just outside of Ziri, the best known example of ancient Greek agoras. Initially, this was used as a gathering place for commercial and residential assemblies. It's also where you'll find the Temple of Hephaestus. You can also encounter the ancient cemetery of Kerameikos, an archaeological site right behind the Church of the Holy Trinity. Oh, and don't forget the ruins of the Roman Agora and the Roman Forum. Returning to take a look at the nightlife a little more, there are plenty of bars in the area that offer a great view of the Athens skyline. It's also very common to find a bunch of clubs and live music. Oftentimes this will make its way out onto the streets. Nearby also holds the Monastiraki Square with the ruins of Hadrian's Library and the Holy Church of the Virgin Mary Pantanesa. That was erected in the 10th century. Alright, next we will dive into a little neighborhood known as Metz. This one was actually named after a Bavarian brewer named Karl Fuchs, founding the beer company Fix and giving Greece their first beer. If there's another thing that this little neighborhood is really known for, it would be the cemetery of Athens, which is full of sculptures. That's situated right by the Loginau Park, and you'll also encounter the monument to George Averof of the first cemetery. Similar to Ziri, this neighborhood also offers a great view of the Acropolis on Arditos Hill. So, being a town named after a brewer, it's really no surprise that the town's history starts from the beer garden on this hill in 1872. Over time, families would start emigrating to this area and they would build neoclassical mansions, giving it its look that we can still see today. On the other side, you can find the Kali Marmaro Stadium, being the world's only one built out of white marble. The name actually translates to beautiful marble. It's also known as the Panathinaik Stadium, and it's said that in the 5th century BC, Socrates and his pupil Phaedrus converged in this area by the Ilosis River. Over time, government revenues would build up as the years went by, and they were able to afford to build this, and it was opened right around 330 BC. Today, it's still used for the very important Panathinaik Games and other sporting events and cultural events important to the nation. Settlement of Metz actually continued all the way up through World War I, and a lot of artists and architects gravitated toward this, making it a slightly more expensive one to live in, but it never lost its charm. Alright, time to shift into a larger one known as Kypseli. Situated in the center of Athens, this neighborhood alone has a population of around 65,000. It's one of the most densely populated areas in Europe, with apartments stacked on top of each other everywhere, hence the name, which translates to beehive. Before the 20th century, it was actually a very rural area. This is also right around when the early houses took on that neoclassical look, but beyond the 1930s, integration of other European styles took precedence. In the later half of the 20th century, it became a hotspot for immigrants such as Nigerians and Ethiopians, Arabs, Albanians, and other Eastern Europeans. As people began to move away, the cheaper rents attracted these immigrants, which caused the neoclassical styles of building to kind of fall into disrepair. Because of how new Kypseli is, there really isn't a lot in terms of ancient archaeology and architecture, so it's not exactly a tourist hotspot, but because of all the immigration, there is so much culture to be found here between the stores and the restaurants and outlets for other foreign foods, ranging anywhere from Russia to the Middle East and beyond. Greek markets are still common here in some spots, and you can find plenty of coffee shops from the pre-urbanization time period. Some other popular spots are the Stella open-air cinemas with a retro look that plays English films, and the Au Revoir drinking hole that's been open since 1958. From this, we'll swing into one known as Konaki, a town with a very similar backstory to Kypseli. Its name translates to Little Column, with its urbanization backstory starting right by the slopes of the neighboring Lykabitas Hill and the 2-meter column located in the town's square. The square initially was literally just this open area with that column until trees began getting planted and surrounding buildings made it into more of a square. The Konaki Museum is housed in an old mansion right by this, and in the wintertime, giant heaters are placed outside so the nightlife can rage on. Speaking of museums, you can also find the Golandris Museum of Cycladic Art, and it's another popular one, along with the Museum of History of Greek Costume and Theater Museum. Not enough, there is also the Byzantine Museum and the War Museum of Athens. I guess the short version is that if you like museums, this might be the spot for you to check out. Fun fact, it's also one of the only areas that was not occupied by the communists during the Greek Civil War between 1946 and 1949. In terms of ancient history, there's also Aristotle's Lyceum, founded in 335 BC, which is a school where he liked to stroll and discuss philosophy. It was excavated in 1996 and then opened to the public in 2014. Some people believe that Aristotle's ghost still roams there to this day. Ooh. But really, it's actually a very calm setting with great smells of rosemary and lavender that many people like to stroll and relax and perhaps reflect a little bit. Speaking of which, the Genadion Library can also be found right here, containing the best collection of Hellenism in the world. Hellenism is the national character of Greek culture. Now, if you actually go up Mount Lykabitas, it provides a great view of the sea and the Peloponnesos Mountains, as well as a gorgeous view of the sunset. How about we do another one in this general area? For something a little different, we'll be moving into the neighborhood of Exarchia. Typically, younger audiences that like a different and alternative vibe are probably going to like this one. Heavily influenced by anarchy and leftism, it's a college town full of politically charged artwork, graffiti, and other niche surroundings. Because of that, it's known for having the best record and music shops in Athens, complete with a side of bars, clubs, and lots of diversity among the people. It should be no surprise then that Exarchia is found right next to the University of Athens, and there isn't a very high presence of police here. Rock clubs such as In Vivo, Texas Necropolis Club, and After Dark are popular spots for smaller bands and counterculture shows of all type. There's also a shrine to Alexander Grigoropoulou, a young boy that was shot by police in 2008 that set off all sorts of riots, and you'll also see some of the most intense graffiti. There are also some of what are known as people's parks, which locals were able to prevent the city from turning into parking lots. Some people like to give this place a bad rep, but really a little bit of common sense can get you just about anywhere safely and give you new experiences. Besides, lots of cozy hotels that are central to the last two areas in downtown Athens make it a solid spot to stay, such as the one right next to the National Archaeological Museum. Shifting gears a little, we are going to hop over to the outskirts of Athens to a neighborhood known as Kypseli. Right off the E75 highway, this is technically a municipality, one of the most affluent in the entire city, which some may also call a suburb. Its abundant greenery and cooler climate have made it a hotspot for wealthy people to retreat ever since the Roman times. Easy access to Mount Piteli and the nearby coastline allow for a quieter getaway for downtown Athens. Fitting in with the old school vibe, you can actually catch a horse ride through the area. The way that we see this area today kind of got its kickstart from the aforementioned Greek War of Independence in the late 19th century. The Kazoulis Mansion might be one of the more popular tourist attractions in this area, as well as the Golandris Natural History Museum. And as this is kind of becoming a theme for all of the places, there are cafes everywhere, and Kuvastaki's Art Institute will give a good sense of the culture in the area. Oh, and right outside of the city limits is the monastery of Agaia Irene Chrysovalantou. In the 9th century, Agaia Irene was seen as a bit of a miracle worker, particularly for mothers who were unable to conceive, living to be 102 years old. Couples from all around the world would actually travel to Greece, come here for prayer, and guests can come and stay as long as they'd like. Looking at the little bit of greenery that isn't necessarily in the mountain range, there's the Sigroa Forest right by the Institute of Agricultural Sciences. Shifting to the other side of Athens, let's have a gander at one of the port towns located right along the coast of the Mediterranean. Piraeus is home to the largest passenger port in all of Europe, making it a touristy spot specifically around cruises. To nobody's surprise, you will find all sorts of seafood restaurants, much of them giving a great view of the Mediterranean. This is another town that also has a pretty significant hand in the ancient history realm. The ancient walls of Piraeus began construction in 493 BC, originally holding two large gates meant to guard the city. They're about 2.5 kilometers kilometers around, free to visit and contain all sorts of artifacts from the area, well reserved, as well as plenty of replicas. Oh, and there are so many churches here. Some are somewhat recently built, while others are centuries old. The Agaya Triada was built after World War II to replace the older one that got leveled by the war, while still being designed around the Byzantine style. You can also find smaller ones like the Agaios Vasilios, built in 1873, that was updated in 1989. The Municipal Theater of Piraeus is a hotspot for shows that opened in 1985, taking about a decade to construct with the neoclassical flair. Getting around here, including downtown Athens, is the famous electric railway known for its glass roof. Now closer to the water, you will see the tribute to the Greeks' genocide memorial in Alexandria Square in reference to the nearly 350,000 Greeks killed by the Turkish government in the early 20th century. The end of the Ottoman period was a rough time. Sports fans might dig seeing a game at the Peace and Friendship Stadium, and the Marble Lion of Piraeus is a neat statue landmark with ancient texts inscribed. Moving to the other side of the coast comes the smaller Rafina. It's another low-key area for those just seeking seafood and beaches. There are ferries and fishing boats, but really the beaches don't get too packed. Mainly, the largest beach stretches from where the port ends and the apartment buildings begin, reaching the edge. Honestly, this is a good spot for seeing nature, people watching, eating, drinking, and relaxing. That is, if you don't go in the dead of summer. Beach bars are certainly common, and it's said that the waves are really good for surfing and other water sports. Nearby, the forested town of Mati was burnt down, claiming many lives, but today you can still see much of the life coming back to this general area. Marikas Beach is just south of Rafina, giving a look at one of the more stony-type coasts that's a bit more difficult to get in and out of the water. As we make our way to the end, let us circle back near the Acropolis. Plaka is a very small area, being the oldest section of Athens. Many of the streets are actually closed off to cars. Take notes, United States. It's also widely believed that this area has been inhabited since the prehistoric times, as per some archaeological findings. Because of that, there is a vast amount of ancient Greek monuments, giving this the nickname Neighborhood of the Gods. These include the Temple of Olympian Zeus, the Arch of Hadrian, one of the many gates to get to the town. There's the Choragic Monument of Lysicrates, as well as the Tower of the Winds, being the first clock tower and weather station in human history. Looking at more ancient theaters, there's the ancient Dionysus by the Parthenon and the Odeon of Herodotus Atticus. Festivals and performances are actually still held in the latter location to this day. Much of the town has been very untouched by modern urban development, likely the biggest reason for it not being very car-friendly. The settlement of Anaphiotika gets its name from the people who constructed the area from the Anifa Island. And it should be no surprise that this area is full of Byzantine-era museums and churches. The 11th century church of Nicholas Rangavas is said to be the city's oldest one. Of course, this doesn't mean there aren't plenty of bars and taverns, with a side of all the touristy souvenir shops you find in areas like that. Because of all the cobblestone streets and the ancient feels, some kind of see the entire area as a bit of an open-air museum, if you will. Fun fact, because of the strict zoning laws, all the utilities such as water, cable, electricity, etc. are completely underground with accessible tunnel access. And last but not least, we'll tune into one that's a little bit more of a square than anything. Syntagma Square is the central square of all of Athens, named after the constitution granted by Otto, the first king of Greece in 1843, following the military uprising. Because of this, it's also sometimes referred to as Constitution Square, which is what Syntagma translates to. It's also said to have one of the most beautiful metro stations in the world. Many of Greece's historic events either took place in or somehow involved this square, making it an important site for celebrations and mourning. One of the most notable ones would be the conflict between the occupying Nazi forces and the communist resistance. Following this, Churchill would then try to return King George to power, which was met with vicious uproar, leading to Greece falling under British influence in exchange for Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary falling under the Soviet influence. That would lead to the aforementioned Civil War, thanks to Greece's own ally bombing working-class neighborhoods, with left-wing forces eventually being put down by the US and the UK. The military junta also led Greece from the late 1960s into the 70s, and when Konstantin Karamanlis returned, he first addressed the people in this square. With all this in mind, it only makes sense that today, most demonstrations against the government are still held here. Speaking of the government, nearby you can see the Parliament building, which was formerly the King's Palace built in the mid-19th century. Like many other countries, Athens has its own Tomb of the Unknown Soldier that can also be found here, and the famous Grande Bretagne Hotel. This location is kind of the centerpiece of the other areas that we discussed, such as the Plaka, the Zeus Temple, the Pantheonaic Stadium, and of course the Acropolis. The neighborhood surrounding the square shares the same name, which is known to have lots of great cafes. And with that, we conclude our 10 neighborhoods. As always, thank you for watching this one, and if you haven't done so already, feel free to check out some of my other videos. This was easily one of the most exciting ones for me to make so far. As before, I'd love to hear some of your feedback, and don't forget to hit subscribe to get notifications. Talk to you all next time. Peace.